Melissa Keller said her husband left for work and never came back. But 3 weeks later, police found John Keller's body buried beneath gravel and soil in their backyard greenhouse, just steps from the home she tearfully searched. From grieving wife to cold-blooded killer, Melissa's story unraveled piece by piece, revealing a web of lies, hidden debt, and a carefully planned murder that shocked an entire town. On a chilly Thursday evening in late October, the town of Pine Brook settled into its usual quiet rhythm. Tucked between rolling hills and thick woods, Pine Brook wasn't the kind of place where people locked their doors or suspected the worst. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other by name and life moved slowly. That's what made John Keller's disappearance so unsettling. John was a 43-year-old auto mechanic who had worked at the same garage for nearly 2 decades. He was known as a man of habit. Up by 6 a.m., out the door by 7, back home by 5:30, dinner by 6 and 8. He never missed work, never took vacations, and was never late. He and his wife, Melissa, had been married for almost 15 years, living in a modest single-story home on the outskirts of town. They didn't have kids, just a big black Labrador named Duke and a few tomato plants in the backyard. Nothing about their life seemed out of the ordinary. That Thursday, John went to work like he always did. Melissa said she made him coffee, packed his lunch, and watched him drive off down the gravel driveway. Everything seemed normal. But when the sun began to set and there was still no sign of John, Melissa said she began to worry. She claimed she called his cell phone several times, no answer. She called the auto shop. One of the mechanics told her John had left around 1 p.m. after saying he didn't feel well. No one had heard from him since. By 9 p.m., Melissa called the local police. She sounded shaken, telling the dispatcher that her husband never disappeared like this. Officers came by that night to take a report. They walked around the property, looked through the garage and the house, and asked Melissa a few questions. There were no signs of forced entry, no sign of a struggle, nothing to suggest that John had been taken or hurt. It was as if he had simply vanished. The next morning, a formal missing person investigation began. Flyers went up across Pine Brook. Police interviewed John's co-workers, family, and friends. They checked surveillance cameras near the auto shop, highway exits, and local stores. Nothing. No one saw John after he left work. His car, a faded blue pickup truck, was still missing. His bank accounts hadn't been touched. His phone was off. It was as if he had walked into thin air. As days passed, more people joined the search. Volunteer groups combed the woods near the Keller property. Drones were sent up. Dogs were brought in. The town buzzed with speculation. Maybe John had run off. Maybe he'd had a breakdown. Maybe it was something darker. But no one could understand why. He wasn't depressed, didn't drink, didn't gamble, and wasn't in any known trouble. Melissa remained the face of the search. She appeared in local news interviews, teary-eyed and pleading for help. She wore John's jacket, clutched old photos of their wedding, and said she couldn't sleep without him next to her. To many, she seemed like a grieving wife clinging to hope. But to others, especially a few sharp-eyed neighbors, something about her seemed off. Several residents noted that Melissa never joined the searches in the woods. She never left water or supplies for the volunteers. She never seemed to ask police what else they were doing. And even as the days stretched into weeks, she didn't appear as frantic or broken as people expected her to be. She said all the right things, but something about how she said them made people uneasy. Then a small but troubling clue surfaced. The teenage boy walking along the river 2 towns over found a rusted red toolbox partially buried in the mud. He opened it and found grease-covered tools and a name etched on the side: J. Keller. Investigators confirmed it belonged to John. But how did it end up miles from home in a place he'd never been known to visit? The discovery prompted a fresh search in the surrounding area, but again, nothing else turned up. The toolbox, though, was enough to shift the investigation's tone. What had once looked like a strange disappearance now began to feel more like a staged vanishing. People started asking different questions, and quietly behind closed doors, police began to re-examine everything they knew about Melissa Keller. As the investigation into John Keller's disappearance deepened, detectives started looking beyond the surface. The toolbox found by the river had raised too many questions. It hadn't been tossed recently. It was dirty, waterlogged, and partially buried. Someone had gone out of their way to put it there, in a place far enough from the Keller home to create confusion. That small rusted box marked the shift from a hopeful search to a growing suspicion that something far worse had happened. Detectives began to examine the life John had left behind. On paper, it looked clean. He had no criminal history, no medical conditions, no substance abuse, and no signs of financial distress. But as they looked more closely, they found oddities, starting with money. About 6 weeks before he vanished, John had taken out a sizable life insurance policy. It wasn't through his job at the garage, but a private policy. The payout was $500,000, and Melissa Keller was listed as the sole beneficiary. The timing raised eyebrows. Melissa had not mentioned it during initial interviews. In fact, when asked about any recent changes in their financial planning, she claimed there were none. When shown the policy later, she said John had taken it out without telling her. Then came the deeper dive into the couple's finances. The Kellers didn't appear wealthy, but they weren't struggling either. John's salary was modest but consistent, and their home was paid off. However, forensic accountants discovered something strange. Melissa had opened 3 credit cards in her name alone within the past year, all maxed out. More than $30,000 in debt. Purchases included luxury clothing, spa treatments, and online orders to high-end retailers. She had also quietly drained a joint savings account, withdrawing $10,000 in cash over several weeks. John's signature was missing on all the withdrawals. None of these financial moves were illegal, but they painted a picture of someone living beyond their means, and doing so in secret. Friends of the couple confirmed that John had no idea about the debt. One even recalled a conversation with him weeks before he vanished, where he expressed concern that Melissa was being a little too loose with the spending lately. Melissa's behavior during the investigation also began to draw scrutiny. She had cooperated, but in a very controlled way. She would answer questions when asked, but rarely offered anything extra. When detectives asked if they could search the house, she hesitated before allowing it, claiming she didn't want the dog to be upset by strangers walking through. No major evidence was found during that initial search, but something felt off. The house was too clean. The garage, where John kept his tools and spent most of his weekends, had been completely reorganized in the week after his disappearance. Then there was the matter of the neighbors. 2 of them, both living directly beside the Keller property, said they had heard arguing in the weeks leading up to John's disappearance. One described it as shouting that didn't sound like a typical married fight. The other claimed he heard something break one night, followed by a door slamming and a car engine starting. Neither had reported it at the time because it wasn't their business. But now they wondered if it had meant something more. As detectives continued to question Melissa, she maintained her story. John left for work, and he never came back. She hadn't noticed anything unusual. She said their marriage was fine, and that couples argued sometimes but always worked through it. She insisted she didn't know anything about the life insurance policy or the missing money. Behind the scenes, investigators obtained search warrants for digital records. Phone logs, email accounts, browsing history all became fair game. What they found added another layer to the mystery. Melissa had been spending a significant amount of time on websites geared toward people seeking emotional support and fresh starts. She had created profiles using variations of her name and posted in forums about feeling trapped, overlooked, and ready for something new. There were messages between her and an unidentified user discussing the difficulty of leaving a relationship and the need to cut ties completely to move on. The messages weren't direct enough to act as evidence of a crime, but they gave detectives the feeling that Melissa Keller's world was far more complicated than she let on. The more they uncovered, the less likely it seemed that John Keller had simply walked away from his life. And just as the investigation reached a frustrating standstill, a single unexpected phone call changed everything. An anonymous tip came in late one night, and the voice on the line was calm and brief. They told police to look behind the Keller house, in the greenhouse. The anonymous tip was taken seriously. In missing persons investigations, most leads go nowhere, but this one had a specific detail, and it came at a time when the case was losing momentum. The caller didn't give a name or explain how they knew, only said that the police should look in the greenhouse behind the Keller house. That was all. The line went dead after that. The Keller property sat on a half-acre lot at the edge of town. Behind the house was a narrow patch of lawn, some overgrown shrubs, and a small greenhouse, about the size of a garden shed. It was old, with weather-stained glass panels and a slightly sagging roof. From the street or driveway you couldn't see it unless you walked around the side of the house. During the initial walkthrough after John's disappearance, police had glanced at the greenhouse but hadn't gone inside. It had been locked, and Melissa had told them it was just for plants and garden tools. There hadn't been a reason to question her at the time. But with the new tip, officers returned, this time with a warrant. It was early morning when they arrived. Melissa stood on the porch in her robe, clutching a mug, visibly confused. She asked what was going on, and officers told her they had received new information. She didn't resist, but seemed agitated. One detective noticed her glance toward the backyard more than once, her eyes flicking nervously past the swing set and toward the trees. The greenhouse door was locked with a basic padlock. Officers cut it off and stepped inside. The air was warm and damp. Rows of potted plants lined shelves along the walls, mostly succulents and small vegetables. There were signs someone had recently spent time inside. The glass had been cleaned. The floor, which would normally be dirt or wood planks, was neatly covered in gravel. Too neatly. One officer noticed that the gravel in the back left corner was a slightly different color. It looked recently disturbed. A cadaver dog, brought along just in case, was sent in. The moment it reached that spot, it began to bark and dig. The officers radioed for backup. Within an hour, forensic teams arrived. They carefully removed the top layer of gravel, then the soil beneath it. About 2 feet down, they hit something unnatural, a folded plastic tarp. Inside the tarp was the badly decomposed body of a man, wrapped tightly and weighed down with bricks. His wallet was still in his pocket. The ID confirmed it. John Keller. A single gunshot wound to the chest had killed him. Based on insect activity and the state of decomposition, forensic examiners believed he had been buried within 24 hours of the day he disappeared. Melissa Keller was arrested on the spot. She was taken into custody without incident, but her demeanor changed entirely. The shocked, grieving wife became silent and detached. She didn't ask where John had been found or express outrage or confusion. She simply sat down and said nothing. Back at the station, police searched the rest of the property. They found boxes of cleaning supplies in the basement and new plastic tarps in the garage, identical to the one used to wrap the body. One receipt found in a kitchen drawer showed that Melissa had purchased gravel, gloves, and a spade from a hardware store just days before John disappeared. The discovery in the greenhouse shook the town of Pinebrook. News spread quickly. For weeks, people had joined search parties and lit candles at vigils, hoping John might still be alive. Now they learned that his body had been hidden just steps from the house, buried in a structure Melissa had visited often. She had walked past him every day, lived above his grave, and kept up the appearance of a desperate wife waiting for news. Detectives reviewed everything they had once more. Surveillance footage from a local home improvement store showed Melissa buying materials: gravel, concrete pavers, plastic sheeting. She had made the purchase alone, 2 days before the date of John's disappearance. A neighbor's security camera, which hadn't been reviewed closely the first time around, captured Melissa dragging several heavy bags into the backyard late at night. The timestamp was just after 2 a.m. on the day John was last seen. Police now had the body, the burial site, the evidence of preparation, and a clear timeline, but there were still questions. Why had she done it? What had happened between them that led to murder? Had she acted alone? Investigators prepared to dig deeper into the digital correspondence and trace connections to the online conversations Melissa had been having. What they found would only add more darkness to a case that was already chilling. Melissa Keller sat in an interrogation room, silent and unmoved, while the rest of the police department scrambled to process the weight of the discovery. For nearly a month she had maintained the story that John simply vanished after work. But now, with his body found buried in their greenhouse, her silence spoke volumes. Detectives knew that something deeply premeditated had taken place, and they were determined to find out how far it went, and whether she had any help. She refused to speak without a lawyer, and when one arrived, her story shifted only slightly. She claimed she had nothing to do with her husband's death, and suggested someone else must have planted his body. But there were too many inconsistencies, too much that couldn't be explained away. The footage, the receipts, the physical evidence, all of it pointed directly to her. Still, detectives wanted more than circumstantial clues. They needed to understand what drove her to commit such an act. Forensic analysts continued combing through Melissa's digital life. Her search history revealed late-night queries on topics like, how deep should a body be buried? How long does decomposition take? And how to erase GPS history. She had read articles about police investigation techniques and studied local laws on property searches. There were even several deleted searches that technicians were able to recover. Questions about how life insurance policies are paid out in cases of murder. That was just the beginning. Melissa's phone records told another story. She had been in frequent contact with a man named Garrett Langston, a name unfamiliar to John's friends and family. Garrett lived 2 states away, in a small city where Melissa had once attended a weekend workshop on wellness and meditation. Phone records showed hundreds of texts and calls exchanged over the past 4 months. The tone of the messages shifted over time, from casual check-ins to romantic flirtations, then darker. Conversations about her need to escape and feeling trapped in a life she didn't choose. Garrett was brought in for questioning. He didn't deny the relationship. He said they had met by chance at the wellness retreat and kept in touch afterward. Melissa told him she was married but unhappy. He claimed he had no idea she was capable of violence and insisted he had no part in John O.'s death. When shown the content of their messages, he looked visibly shaken. In one message, Melissa wrote, "Sometimes I think I'd be free if he just didn't come home one day." Another said, "I already know what I'd do. I just need the courage." While these didn't directly implicate Garrett, they painted a troubling picture of Melissa's mindset. She had been fantasizing about life without her husband for weeks, maybe longer. Police searched Garrett's phone and apartment but found no evidence he had been involved. His alibi for the night of John's murder checked out. It became clear Melissa had acted alone, but had emotionally entangled Garrett in her growing delusion of escape. Back in Pinebrook, people who once felt sympathy for Melissa now viewed her with stunned disbelief. She had stood in front of TV cameras crying, thanking volunteers, and pleading for information, all while knowing her husband's body was hidden beneath gravel in their backyard. The entire time, she had been focused on managing appearances, knowing that if she played the part well enough, suspicion would never touch her. Even more disturbing was how carefully she had planned the crime. Investigators learned she had purchased the new padlock for the greenhouse 3 weeks before John disappeared. The gravel had been delivered in bulk and paid for in cash. She had transferred the last of the savings into her personal account and delayed paying bills. Melissa hadn't just committed murder, she had planned for the aftermath in chilling detail. At trial, prosecutors presented the timeline with precision: the affair, the debt, the insurance policy, the obsessive searches, the carefully purchased materials, the emotional manipulation of friends, neighbors, and law enforcement. It was a picture of cold, calculated intent. The defense argued there was no direct evidence of the act itself, no confession, no eyewitnesses, but the jury didn't need a smoking gun. The weight of the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. As the trial neared its end, the community waited anxiously for the verdict. Everyone had watched the story unfold from mystery to nightmare, and when the final decision came, it landed with a sense of grim inevitability. Melissa Keller was found guilty of first-degree murder. The question that lingered was not just how she could have done it, but how she managed to convince so many people for so long that she was innocent. Melissa Keller's conviction brought a sense of closure to Pine Brook, but not comfort. The trial had revealed far more than most were prepared to hear. Over the course of several days, the courtroom had transformed into a stage where the private life of the Kellers was dissected piece by piece, exposing a reality no one had suspected. The woman once seen as a quiet, devoted wife was now understood as someone capable of extreme deception. Her mask had cracked, and behind it was something no one had imagined. During sentencing, Melissa showed no emotion. She stared straight ahead as the judge read the verdict: guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Reporters noted her lack of reaction, her expression unreadable, as if she had resigned herself to the outcome long before the gavel struck. Her attorney later revealed she had refused to testify in her own defense, against his advice. She never explained why she killed John, never gave a single reason. The town was left to interpret the silence in its own way. For some, the motive was clear enough: money, a new lover, a chance to escape a life she no longer wanted. But others believed it wasn't just one thing that led Melissa to murder. It was pressure building over time: financial stress, emotional isolation, the desire for reinvention. And instead of confronting her problems or leaving the marriage, she chose to erase her husband altogether. In the weeks following her conviction, investigators continued to tie up loose ends. They released a full timeline of events to the public. John Keller had arrived at work the morning of his disappearance, then left shortly after lunch complaining of a headache. He had returned home unaware of what awaited him. Based on forensic evidence, he was likely shot inside the garage, wrapped in a tarp, and dragged to the greenhouse under cover of darkness. Melissa had spent hours covering the burial site with soil, gravel, and plants, creating the illusion of a peaceful garden retreat. Later, she calmly called the police to report him missing. Forensic specialists later determined the bullet used to kill John matched a gun registered to Melissa's late father. The weapon had never been reported stolen or missing, and was found hidden behind insulation in the attic. It was loaded with the same type of ammunition found in a box in the garage, yet another quiet detail she had thought through ahead of time. Every aspect of the crime, from the preparation to the cleanup, pointed to a calculated effort to control the narrative. People who knew Melissa still struggled to reconcile her actions with the person they thought they knew. Former co-workers recalled her as reserved but friendly. A few neighbors described her as someone who waved from across the street, but never really let people in. She wasn't known for socializing, but no one thought that unusual. Pine Brook was full of people who kept to themselves. Looking back, though, many started to remember moments that now felt different. Small, uneasy interactions, strange comments, the way she seemed to shut down when asked personal questions. The case became a cautionary tale. News outlets ran with headlines about the greenhouse murder and documentaries followed. Podcasts analyzed her psychology, debating whether she was a sociopath or simply pushed beyond her limits. The story gained traction online, where true crime communities dissected every bit of court testimony and theorized about what had really happened in the final hours of John Keller's life. Eventually, the Keller home was sold. The new owners tore down the greenhouse within a month of moving in. They didn't want the land associated with anything dark. The soil was dug up and replaced. A new flower bed was planted where John's body had once been hidden. But even with the physical traces gone, the memory lingered. People still slowed their cars when passing the house. Children crossed the street to avoid walking too close. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the weight of knowing what had happened there. John Keller was laid to rest in the town cemetery, not far from the garage where he'd spent most of his life. His headstone was simple: name, birth and death dates, and the words, "Loved and remembered." The community came together for a memorial service, a final attempt to honor a man whose life ended in betrayal. In Pinebrook, people still talk about the case with a mix of sadness and disbelief, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous secrets live behind the quietest doors.